Welcome, everybody. We're both here and on Zoom, and so I got to kind of look where I'm looking at my notes. But I'm Kim Brigham from the Bonner Milltown History Center. We are. Oh, yeah, I can move that. Thanks, Mary. We're glad to have you, everybody, here and out in Zoom land. And it's a celebration of the first day of spring, 9:33 a.m. this morning, as you probably all know. It's now officially spring. I think this is a time in the Bonner history of regeneration, I'd say. You may have noticed the new fire station as you're coming from Missoula. Down here on the old mill site. The mill site here is a booming and expanding all the time. We've got rid of the big pile of dirty dirt that was contaminated in the last several months. That's gone from the mill site. What else? Milltown State Park is a really going concern. Access to like 3 or 4 different parts of the park now around the confluence of the rivers. Marshall Mountain now is open to the public on the other end of the Bonner district, and in the last few months there for recreating, etc. So this is a good time to be spring in Bonner. For the people out in Zoom land, we're in the new part of the Bonner School cafeteria. We have a crowd, I think 35 people I counted, plus all the technicians from the Bonner Milltown History Center, and so we're excited to have this particular topic because this has been 2 years in the making. Or 2 years in the waiting, I guess you would say. The third weekend of March in 2020 Mary was graciously going to come over from Helena to give this same or similar presentation with this topic. And you all know what happened the third weekend of March in 2020, and we're still trying to pull ourselves out of that. But she waited for us, and she's back. And I think you're going to really enjoy this. We do acknowledge that we gather in the ancestral homeland of the Salish and Kalispel or Ponderay people who've lived here since time immemorial. We offer our respect for their history and culture and for their enduring care and protection of our shared lands and waterways. A quick note of thank yous. Oops, I'm not standing in front of the camera. A quick note of thank yous. The folks at Travelers Rest that kind of guided us through this Zoom live hybrid type of program, and we owe a lot of thanks to those people. Molly Stockdale, Macy McPherson. Bonner School. For the first time, we were able to have these in Bonner School on a Sunday afternoon. Great Wi-Fi, great technology, and Superintendent Jim Howard and Al Simons and Bill Wilsonoff, the maintenance supervisor, who's helped just get everything set up for us and just say go when we go. The Friends of Two Rivers are our sponsoring nonprofit organization. Of course, Walter Peckham has been with us for years and years as our professional and faithful sound guy. And of course, thank you to Mary for spending so much time on this particular subject that's kind of near and dear to our hearts here in Bonner. And it's an amazing story, really. So I keep on rattling. It's my thought that we should get a little background on what we're talking about. This is the foundation of Bonner and the Bonner Mill was before the Anaconda Company ever appeared on the scene. So we're talking, you get to travel back in time, and then Mary will kind of connect us with that time and today through her family bloodlines and other, not all bloodlines, I guess. It wasn't the Anaconda Company, but the big Blackfoot Milling Company. Underwent a series of name changes, but I think it's easiest for us now to call it the Hammond Mill. Hammond Mill was, got to get here. Oh. This is a quick timeline. Directly tied to the Northern Pacific Railroad and construction thereof, the people that got the contract to furnish all the wood products in the early 1880s to build the Northern Pacific across western Montana are the same ones who in 1884 began construction of the central dam, or the central mill. To build the railroad, there was a series of temporary sawmills up and down the Clark Fork River. When that got done, then we have the Bonner Mill. In 1884, the first dam was built that year, and then it washed out right away. This is the first mill dam across behind the mill on the Blackfoot. We'll go into some of these other happenings, but that's what laid the foundation. And in 1898, there at the bottom, is the sale to the Marcus Daly and the Anaconda Company, which went through, I think, in August of 1898. And they bought it for $1.5 million, and Anaconda was then, I guess, the face and father of this community for the next 74 years until 1972. So long before there was the Anaconda Company, there were the first river, actually I shouldn't advance that. There was the first river drives. 1886 was the first one, and for the next 13 years, the Hammond Mill operators logged the Blackfoot and sent the logs all down by the river. And Anaconda continued that practice for, I think, another 13 years before the railroad got built up, the Blackfoot, and there was a safer and more efficient way to move the logs down to the mill. Of course, that was then also the first logging camps up the Blackfoot for those years. Trying to find my place here. First 8 houses apparently were built in 1886, the year that the actual sawmill began at Bonner. June 6th was the first log milled in 1886, and then the mill went into full operation that July, and the houses started being built that are continuing today. The first school was on the north end of Bonner as you're leaving, going up to Blackfoot, in a 2-story house or two-story building that was also referred to as the Masonic Lodge. This is a picture of the class of 1895, which I think is the oldest class picture we have. But by 1895, there were quite a few kids going to school in Bonner. And we will get into some stories about Margaret Robinson and Georgina Fenwick, who Mary will give us a lot of details about her, I guess, cousin, Georgina, or Georgie, yes. And Margaret Robinson, of course, was the first teacher. And so that was the era where the Margaret Hotel was built, 1892. That was not built by the Anaconda Company. That was a Hammond and a Bonner enterprise. You see it at the bottom in the middle there. That shows you kind of how it was positioned in Bonner. And now that's the empty park here across from the post office in Bonner. The front door, well, there's the ornate 1892 Gilded Age motel. And we got the front steps are facing down towards the river, in other words, down towards the mill, not like maybe we pictured it facing out towards the modern highway, etc. Quite an enterprise. And as far as we know, it was named Margaret Hotel after Margaret Robinson, the first teacher. And of course, the Hammond Brothers that Mary will be getting into, we all know, or maybe most of us know about A.B. Hammond, who was the, I guess, the mastermind of a lot of things, but the Bonner Mill, etc. But in truth, his brother Henry, who was, I think, 2 years younger, was the face of Bonner. He was the first general manager out here, all during the time of the Hammond Mill. If you saw Hammond on the streets of Bonner in the 1890s, it was most likely to be Henry. He was the postmaster for those 10 years. He was he built the schoolhouse. He was the first member of the school board in 1889. And he was here until the mill sold to Anaconda. In our grassroots book, I got it. You got one. Yeah. There we got which was published for the bicentennial of the United States in 1976. One of the precious gems that is included in this is a letter that you can't probably read on the screen. It's in the packets that we handed out to the live audience. But it was a letter written shortly before her death by Georgina Fenwick, whose father George was, well, he was a big wig at the mill. And Georgina talked a little bit about living in the Margaret Hotel with her family. And one of her observations was, my uncle Andrew B. Hammond, president of the Missoula and Bonner operations, often brought friends and business associates to Bonner. We had quarters in one wing of the Margaret Hotel, and my other uncle, Henry Hammond, and Miss Robinson had their meals with us. Uncle Henry was, let's go back. Uncle Henry was rather stern and a bachelor. We children were somewhat in awe of him, so behaved properly when he was around.
Okay, that's it.
Okay.
No more pictures for you.
I got one more thing. So the Anaconda Company did purchase the mill in 1898, as I said, and it became part of the Anaconda Empire for the next 74 years until Anaconda sold its Montana holdings. That was the end of the first era of Bonner, an era that portended the ups and downs of a mill and a community for the next century and more. For Georgie Fenwick, it was a time of youth that stayed with her until her dying days, and one that continues to echo through the generations. Georgie, in the letter that's in your packet, she closes with this paragraph. There was a radiance to living for children growing up in Bonner all those years ago. Children, as I remember, felt secure, enjoyed people and places, loved what they saw and did. It was a free and happy life for children, skating in the winter on the river, climbing the mountains back of Bonner in the summer, picking wild flowers, chokeberries, and elderberries, picnicking in the fields by the rushing streams born of the snowpack. I'm glad I lived for a while in Bonner. The radiance of that freedom remains with me. So, growing up, Mary was Mary Mulroney on McLeod Avenue in Missoula, Montana.
Not obnoxious.
She graduated from Missoula County High School and the Missoula University that was then known as Montana State University, correct?
Right.
She moved to Helena after graduation in 1964 with her new husband, Myron, and has lived there ever since. She credits her interest in genealogy to her freshman social studies teacher at Missoula County High School, Robert Watt, and it has grown and blossomed, I guess, since then, but she's got one of the more interesting family trees. I first met Mary at the Stories and Stones program at the Missoula the Catholic Cemetery, St. Mary's. She was at that time talking about the Mulroney side of her family. Today she'll talk her father's side. Today she'll talk about the other side, her mother's side, which has its roots in the McLeod family and others, as you're about to see. And I am about to shut up and let her do her thing.
Thank you, Kim. When Kim asked me to do this, I said, I blithely said, sure, I'll talk about my relatives. I had no idea what I was getting myself into. I knew that A.B. Hammond had something to do with it. I knew the names of the Fenwicks and of course, the McLeods and Coombs, and who am I leaving out? Beckwith. That's good. So I made this chart. At the top one, the Coombs, are 8 of the 16 Coombs children that were born in New Brunswick. All these people came from New Brunswick, okay? And 7 of the 8 came to Montana and are buried in the Missoula City Cemetery. I put down Sarah because she's married to Andrew Hammond Sr., the father of the Andrew who came here. And why is she important? Well, after she died, Andrew married her sister Gloriana. And Gloriana is buried out in Missoula City Cemetery. I have a picture over on the table of her stone, which is a rather impressive stone. Those in color are those who came and worked for Andrew Hammond. So the second row, the green names, are Gloriana's and Andrew Sr.'s 6 children. So the oldest was Sarah, and then Frederick, George, Andrew, the one we know as A.B., Henry, who also went by W.H., and then Mary, who was married to George Fenwick. The third generation, in blue, are Sarah and Charles Beckwith's 3 daughters. They had 9 children altogether, but the 3 daughters married Charles Herbert McLeod, who was known as C.H., John Martin Keith, who was also known as Jack, and Emma married George, we love his middle name, we don't know where he got it from, George Burpee McLeod. And Charles, or I'm going to call him Herb, because that's what he was called, but on official documents he was CH. Herb and George were cousins. So it is a family affair. And though Jack Keith was not a blood relative, he did marry our aunt, so he would be Uncle Jack. Let's see if I told you everything you need to know about that. Let's see, I have to go this way. So there's AB, or Andrew, and his brother Fred. I doubt he looked like that when he first came out here. And brother Henry, who had probably the most to do with living in Bonner, and not only working for the mill, but also at the hotel. Oh, then there's our chart again. We'll go down to the third generation. C.H. McLeod, who was my great-grandfather, and also Annie, Sir Mullen's grandfather, and Annie sitting back there with her granddaughter, Elizabeth. Annie, raise your hand. And Elizabeth, thank you. So Annie and I are cousins. We're only 3 years apart, but she's my mother's first cousin. And I'm not going to explain to you about the first and second cousins once removed and all that stuff. Here's Jack Keith and George McLeod. Oh, so how am I exactly related? Let's see. Let's go back to there. So Sarah and Charles Beckwith had Clara. Clara married C.H. McLeod. C.H. McLeod and Clara had Walter and Helen, Annie's mother. And Walter and his wife, Olive, who we'll call Olive Sr., had Olive Jr. Olive Jr. married Tom Mulroney, and they had me. There. Now you know the whole family history.
Is that the end of the line?
Right, then I have to go to the next one.
You want to go to Georgina?
No, we're going to the Octopus.
Oh, the octopus? That's right back in the beginning.
Oh, at the beginning, okay. There's the Octopus. So, A.B. Hammond had his fingers in a lot of pies. And this was a political cartoon that was in the Missoulian, and I want to say we found it was 1891, or 2 or 3, somewhere around there. But each of those arms was something that he had his fingers in. And I'll mention a few of them as we go and talk along. Okay, that's the Octopus. I don't know exactly how or when some of these people came to the Montana Territory, except for those who came on the Northern Pacific Railroad, which began in 1883, after it arrived in Montana. So, we're going to get rid of that. There. We're going to start with Andrew and his brother George. They came from St. Leonard, New Brunswick, which is right across the St. John River from Van Buren, Maine. And if you don't realize, Maine goes up into New Brunswick, and Quebec is also up there on your left-hand side, if you're looking at a map. As young men, they worked as loggers in both New Brunswick and in Maine, and then on into Pennsylvania. Now, there are 2 versions of how they came. One was that they came together up the Missouri to Fort Benton, and there's Greg George, oh, that's what I forgot to do, is show the books, which I'll do. Greg Gordon's book or Dale Johnson's doctoral thesis on Andrew. One may tell one story, one is the other, but by 1868, they were in Fort Benton. So let me go back and show you the books that I used and my material that I used to do this talk. The first is the Bonner book, The Story of Bonner. Then we have Dale Johnson's Andrew B. Hammond, Education of a Capitalist of the Montana Frontier. This was his doctoral thesis. There's nothing to see on the front. Then Greg Gordon's book, When Money Grew on Trees. Next was Miney Smith's The Missoula Mercantile. Then there was an interview in 1953 with George McLeod called The Story of the Hammond Lumber Company. It's very hard to read, that didn't print really well. And Paul Sharp's book, The Whoop Up Country. And this is a very interesting book to read about the trail between Fort Benton up to Fort McLeod and the whiskey runners and fur traders. Then Ken Robinson has just recently written Historic Tales of the Whoop Up Country. And the last one is The Names on the Faces of Montana by Roberta Karkichini. And this is a wonderful book if you're wondering about a place that doesn't even exist anymore. I'll tell you which one I've found in this one. I also used internet sites like Ancestry.com, newspapers.com, FamilySearch.org, and Wikipedia. You can just type it in and it pops up. It's wonderful. Okay, so they are in Fort Benton, and they really were interested in mining and seeing if they couldn't get a claim. But they found they were a little bit late. So they left Fort Benton and came west, got as far as Hellgate, hung around a little bit. Then George bought a herd of horses, and the two of them set off for the west coast. They landed on the Washington coast and worked for a lumber company there for, maybe a year and a half for AB. George got itchy feet and went on down to California and to the Sierras, interested in mining and lumbering. And the next time I read about him, he's coming up from Utah with a herd of horses back up to Montana and ends up in Fort Benton. We'll talk about him a little bit later. In the meantime, AB, Andrew, comes back to Missoula in 1870, actually to Hellgate, and works for George White in his store. Shortly thereafter, George White dies, and Andrew stays on and helps his wife with the store and selling out the merchandise and going after the accounts. Where am I? 2 years later, Richard Eddy convinced him to go to Missoula and work for the E.L. Bonner Company, their general store. So between 1872 and 1876, besides clerking in the store, he tries his hand at selling medicines, and he had a ranching venture with his Uncle Walt Coombs and his brother Fred near Flathead Lake, which they later sold to Conrad Coors in 1878. And in the book it said that Valentine Coombs was the postmaster at Flathead Lake. 3 words, Flathead Lake. And sure enough, in this book, there it is. And it was originally called something else. We don't know exactly where it was located. I'm assuming it was at the head of the lake and possibly around Summers. In 1876, 4 years after starting his employment with the Missoula store, Andrew became a partner, and the name of the store changed from Bonner and Company to Eddie Hammond and Company. And that was the year that Eddie Hammond and Company built their own store on the corner of Higgins Avenue and East Front Street. A new building was added a couple years later. They were doing so well as stables across the street to house the mule teams. Business was going so well that more workers were needed. So Andrew wrote to his relatives back in New Brunswick asking them to send hard-working young men. One of the first to come was Herbert McLeod, who was hired to clerk in the store. A few months before he died in 1946, he was interviewed by the Missoulian, and he said he'd been clerking in a store, and this is what he had to say. He was getting $400 a year in New Brunswick, and the job offered me in Missoula was $1,000 a year. $400 to $1,000 a year. Nothing would have stopped me from taking advantage of that opportunity. I would have walked to Montana, but came across the country by rail, and from Corinne, Utah to Butte by narrow gauge railroad. In fact, I came only to Bear Canyon, south of the present town of Dillon, by rail. From there to Missoula, the trip was by stage. That old narrow gauge was the only railroad in Montana, and that was in 1880. He arrived on March 29th, 1880, and went to work the next day. In later years, he managed many of Hammond's businesses, and his name was among several found on incorporation papers of the Blackfoot Mining and Manufacturing Company, and I'll talk about him later. By 1881, the Northern Pacific Railroad had entered Montana, and the lumber contract was awarded to Eddie Hammond and Company, which included clearing the right-of-way, building wagon roads, and furnishing lumber for ties, tunnels, trestles, and bridges to be used on the road from the Little Blackfoot River to the Pend Oreille Lake, over 200 miles. Another source said from the Mullen Pass to Thompson Falls, which is not quite 200 miles. And that included 3,000 ties per mile. In addition, the company would also supply all the provisions, clothing, blankets, everything the loggers needed, except for steel. To begin with, they had 5 portable sawmills, and they had 3 more on order. More men were needed, and Andrew supposedly told a Missoulian reporter that a sober and able logger could earn upward from $50 per month. By 1882, all 3 brothers and Uncle Walt Coombs were working for Andrew. Andrew had asked George to come from Fort Benton and take charge of the lumber operations in the Hellgate Canyon. Henry was fulfilling portions of the right-of-way of contract in the Weeksville Horse Plains area in Sanders County. Horse Plains is another name that's in Roberta Karkichini's book. Fred was hauling ties from Weeksville, and Uncle Walt Coombs was hired to oversee freight operations. Soon after the NP arrived in 1883, George and Mary Fenwick, now Mary was Andrew's youngest sister, with their children Frederick and Georgina, arrived. George had been teaching school, and before leaving New Brunswick was on the staff of the Collegiate College in Fredericton. George was appointed inspector and shopping clerk by the Montana Improvement Company, which became the big Blackfoot Milling Company. And in 1885, he was treasurer. About that time, he purchased a sawmill and a site 25 miles east of Missoula for the Hammond interests. And I'm wondering if this wasn't Bonita. Uncle Robert Coombs, this is the first that he shows up, was sent by Andrew to run the new mill at Bonita and establish a logging camp up nearby Kramer Gulch. The following is from Greg Gordon's book. When Hammond's logging crew arrived the next fall, they discovered 50 Métis loggers employed by the mill owner from the Butte area, busy cutting timber. Hearing of this, Robert, armed with a revolver, hurried from the mill with a group of men intent on driving out the invaders. The Métis finally backed down after some brawling and the arrival of a well-known lumberjack who announced he would fight any 2 men, no make that's 3, if there were any who dared face him. No one took him up on the challenge. Later, Fred was sent to Bonita, and George Fenwick was later sent to take over from Fred. Uncle Robert Coombs also was hired to build that first dam on the Blackfoot that washed out and then was later rebuilt the next year, I believe. In July of 1886, the Blackfoot mill at Bonner was completed, and Henry Hammond took charge of operations as manager. As soon after the Bonner Mill Company assumed the assets of the Montana Improvement Company, and the following year was reorganized into the Big Blackfoot Milling Company. In the Articles of Incorporation were listed C.H. McLeod, John M. Keith, Charles E. Beckwith, which was the oldest sister's husband, George L. Hammond, and 50 others. Then there's another article of incorporation that shows A.B. Hammond, C.H. McLeod, W.H. Hammond, J.M. Keith, Eddie Bonner, and Hathaway. The last one to come is George McLeod. He arrived in 1891 at age 20 after his father had written their cousin Herb asking if there might be a position for George in the Hammond operation. George McLeod's first job was as janitor and stock boy in a warehouse packing goods. He was a good draftsman, so had fun writing with flourish the names on the lots to be sent out. He then was sent to the Bonner Mill, where he did everything. Janitor, cleaned out cuspidors, lit the fire, split the wood. There were no toilets, the chick sale was out back. He knew nothing of the lumber business, and he was the one who said this in his interview. He started out writing invoices and figuring lumber, checking contents of railroad cars to see that orders had been filled out correctly and billed to the right person. In a year or so, he picked up a lot of general information, though even then he said he hardly knew anything about the business. At Andrew's suggestion, he learned about lands and manufacture, prices and freight rates, among other things, so he would be, as he said, well posted. George had already been taught the Canadian system of surveys and the U.S. system back in Canada. He was one of the earliest residents of Bonner, along with George Fenwick and Robert Coombs, and in 1897 was clerk of the Bonner School District. Though unhappy after the sale of the Big Blackfoot properties to Marcus Daly in 1898, he stayed on as clerk for the Anaconda Company for over 2 years for 2 reasons. He had to have the work. He needed the work. And Andrew wanted him to remain there to clean up a lot of things like collecting accounts and things connected to the electrical business that Andrew had retained out of the sale of the mill. George's position at the time was office clerk, but it seems he had a lot more clout about land sales and that sort of thing. Things came to a head, though, when the manager of the division put his own brother over George at $25 more a month, which meant he was getting $150 a month instead of $125 a month. And George also discovered he was stealing from the Anaconda's lumber division, the Anaconda Company. That is the history of their association with the Anaconda Company, or not the Anaconda Company, the Big Blackfoot Mill. So we're going to go back and talk about each one of what happened to them. Andrew left Missoula permanently before 1900. Moving to Portland, where he started the Hammond Lumber Company, one of the largest lumber companies on the West Coast, including the world's largest redwood lumber company, and the world's largest lumber company in Los Angeles. From Portland, he moved to San Francisco, where he had his offices, and he died there in San Francisco in 1934. He's buried in Cypress Lawn Memorial Park, Colma, California, along with several members of his family. Now, Uncle Valentine, Walt Coombs, shows up for the first time in Montana as postmaster at Flathead Lake. In the 1880 census, he's listed as a farmer in Missoula County. After working for Andrew, he went to Helena, and from 1888 to 1892, he's listed in a business directory as president and treasurer of the Helena Lumber Company. Now, I don't know if this had any ties to the Hammond outfit or not, but he's listed in, for sale was wholesale and retail lumber, lath, shingles, sash, doors, and blinds, wood, and coal. He died in 1893 while traveling near Joplin, Missouri. I have no idea where he was going, whether he was coming or going. His obituary reads, though, that before he left the state, he managed the Margaret Hotel in Bonner. He's buried in the Missoula Cemetery and shares a stone with his sister Caroline Coombs Hammond, who died in 1894. The next brother, Fred, that was, what happened to Robert? Hopefully we'll come upon Robert, his brother. So, Andrew's brothers, by 1891, Fred was living in Great Falls and had a lumber yard under the name of F.A. Hammond and Company. For sale, lath, lumber, lath, shingles, sash, doors, ceilings, siding, stair work, etc. on 11th Street and 9th Avenue North. The business was still listed in 1894, the year he became a U.S. citizen. He died in 1903 in Los Angeles and was buried in the Missoula City Cemetery. His probate revealed that he had a house in Missoula and property in Great Falls and Helena. Brother George Hammond had quite an adventurous life. When he returned to Montana in 1870, he was back in Fort Benton and is listed in the 1870 census as a wood chopper at the wood yard below Fort Benton. And I love the description. It was the seventh wood yard below Musselshell. He went to the Northwest Territory where he helped build Fort Hamilton, known as the Hoop-Up Fort. For the next 8 years, he wolfed and traveled and traded furs in southern Alberta, in the Cypress Hills of Saskatchewan, and Fort Benton, and sold horses to the Northwest Mounted Police. In 1871, he was in Charles Rowe's expedition that built Fort Stide. He was involved in the Spitzy Cavalry in 1872 and was said to have fired the first shot in the Cypress Hills Massacre of June 1st, 1873, but did not participate in the worst of the violence that day. And you have to read the Hoop-Up books to get those stories. He also volunteered in the Montana Militia during the Nez Perce Wars of 1877, but didn't see any action. He'd married Rose Wells in Fort Benton in 1874, and by 1878 returned to Fort Benton to farm. In the 1880 census, he's listed as a freighter in Fort Benton. And that brings us up to 1882, when he's called to take charge of the lumber operation in the Hellgate Canyon. Also that year, he bought a ranch in the Ovando Valley, a mile northwest of Ovando. He moved to the ranch in 1885, where he ranched and raised horses. It is speculated that he bought the ranch also for the timber for the mill. He moved to Missoula in 1899, then back to the ranch in 1903, where he died in 1904. He's buried in the Ovando Cemetery. Henry Hammond, besides managing the mill in 1891, was elected to the board of directors of the Little Anaconda Mining Company. Henry was also very community-minded. In 1886, he became one of 3 election judges, along with his uncle Robert Coombs, for the first election held in the Bonner precinct. Henry and others petitioned the Missoula County Commissioners for a new school district, which was established March 14, 1889. The following month, Henry was elected a trustee of Bonner District Number 41 for a 3-year term and was re-elected again in 1897. He also held the position of second postmaster in Bonner, which Kim mentioned, from 1888 to 1899. In a weekly Missoulian article, he was described as a plain, unassuming, and everyday fellow, and stated that he was almost overcome with emotion when presented with a diamond pin in the presence of the mill workers at the end of the season. At the end of 1889, he became a U.S. citizen. There's another article in the Weekly Missoulian of 1892 about the Margaret Hotel, which read, "The Margaret, Bonner's beautiful little hotel ready for business under the supervision of W.H. Hammond." And as was mentioned before, he lived at the hotel, as did the school teacher, and for a few years, the George Fenwick family, and they took their meals together. George's eldest daughter, Georgina, which we grew up knowing as Georgie, described him, oh, but you've already said this, was rather stern and was a bachelor. And his children, they were in awe of him, and so behaved very properly around him. In 1892, he's listed as president of the Big Blackfoot Milling Company. And in 1893, Henry and George Fenwick started a poultry farm as an experiment to see how it would fare as a business in the area. No idea what happened to the poultry farm. He retired in 1898 when the mill was sold to the Anaconda Mining Company, and he sold his house in Missoula. However, he continued to work for his brother Andrew. In 1890, Andrew sent him, first he sent George Fenwick, and then he sent Henry to look over a mill in Northern California that was for sale. Both men came back and said it looked like a good prospect. So when Andrew bought the mill, he put Henry in charge of building a new company town. He moved the company's main office from Eureka to Samoa, built 100 houses, new bunkhouse, cookhouse, general store, small hotel with private dining room and suite for Andrew, and a social hall on the second floor. In the early 1950s, I went with my grandfather McLeod to California, and one of the stops was at Samoa, and all I remember of that trip, I think I was in 4th grade, was looking at the hotel. We didn't go in. I just remember my grandfather talking to these men. And it was about the time that the mill was sold to Georgia Pacific. I stopped there once again. In the early 70s, we took our 2 boys to California, and we stopped at Samoa. I think we saw some advertising or something about you could have lunch at the cookhouse, and we did. They served family style, and so everybody sat at the same long tables. They put the food out in front of us, and you helped yourselves. And then they brought out dessert, which was tapioca pudding. And the waitress saw how fast my boys ate that tapioca pudding and came around and said, "Would you like another?" And they said, "Uh-huh." So she brought them another. Also on the wall was a picture of Missoula Mercantile employees. I don't know, they were all standing along the wall of a building. I don't know what the purpose of the picture was, but I was able to pick out my great-grandfather, which would have been, the picture was taken in the 1880s. In 1910, the U.S. Census finds Henry living in Oakland, California as a boarder and owner of a flour mill. January of 1919, he marries, and 5 months later he dies, leaving an estate of under $100,000, which included a ranch north of Chico, California in Butte County. And sadly, I don't know where he's buried. Haven't been able to find him. Haven't been able to find him on graves.com. Now, hope I haven't lost my papers. Obviously, I'm not a public speaker. You're taking a chance on me. Well, it's right here in front of me. George Fenwick. They were the ones who came out on the train in 1883, soon after it arrived in Missoula. He became a citizen in 1886 and was elected trustee for the new school district in Bonner in 1887. Sometime between 1987 and 1889, he went to Helena as the general manager of the Helena Lumber Company. I'm assuming the same that his uncle, well, not his uncle, but Andrew's uncle, Walt, was president and treasurer of. Exactly when he went to Helena is a bit of a mystery. However, in the Missoula Weekly Gazette, in 1881, it was announced he was leaving Helena permanently to make his headquarters in Bonner. According to the Bonner book, he was one of the first town's early residents. And the first house they lived in was next to the company store where the youngest Fenwick, Anne, was born. Oh, there's Anne. I didn't even push the button. How did that happen? Magic. Anne was born there in 1891. Her sister Harriet was born in 1887 and brother George in 1890 in Missoula. In the early 90s, the Fenwicks moved into the Margaret Hotel, and I mentioned earlier about George and Henry Hammond and the poultry farm. After the mill sold to the Anaconda Company, George continued to work for Andrew, and he was the first one to send out to the coast, to Eureka, to look over the mill. When Andrew bought the outfit, George became general manager, and the family, George and family lived at the site known as Samoa up until about 1923 when they moved to San Francisco. He's listed in the San Francisco City Directory with the Hammond Lumber Company in 1926, the year he died. He's buried in Mountain View Cemetery in Oakland, California, along with his wife, Mary, son, Gerald, daughters, Georgina, Harriet, Anne, Anne's husband, Spencer Brush, and George's sister, Susan Sharp. I was unable to find an obituary for George, but as I was searching the internet, I found numerous references to the George W. Fenwick, a merchant steam vessel. It seems that Andrew got into shipbuilding after he got out to California, and he named his first large steel ship built at Fairhaven, just below Samoa on Humboldt Bay, the George W. Fenwick, which carried lumber from the Tongue Point Mill in Washington to San Pedro, California. It was also equipped with the largest towing machine so that it towed many rafts to San Francisco Bay from Stella, Washington. And there we have the three sisters, Georgina, who we call Georgie, Anne, who married Spencer Brush, and whose daughter, we called her Zib, and her kids came to Montana to visit up at City Lake. I don't know if they were there more than once, but my sisters remember them. By that time I was married and off to Helen, so I didn't get to be with them. And then Hundy, Harriet. I'm losing my place again. I get to talking and forget where I am. Georgie and Hundy never married and lived together until they died. Georgie died in 1976, and Hundy died the following year. As a child, my mother and I visited them several times. I thought their little backyard was magical. They visited our McLeod relatives at City Lake many summers, and I spent my spring break my freshman year in college lying on their couch reading James Michener's Hawaii. I did more than read. Georgie took her 5-year-old great niece and me to the zoo and drove us down the famous wiggly Lombard Street. She was 80 years old at the time and drove all over San Francisco. Didn't faze her at all. I don't think Hundy probably ever drove. I think Georgie took her everywhere. She also set me up with a date with a friend's grandson who drove a Porsche. Driving around San Francisco in a Porsche was really neat. The last time I saw Georgie and Hundy, they had my husband and my 16-year-old son to dinner in their home, and I'll never forget the dessert. It was called Floating Island, which was a soft pudding with a soft meringue floating on top. It's the first one I've ever had, and I'm not sure I've ever had one since, but I'd sure like to learn how to make one. Maybe I can find a recipe on the internet. You know how, Marianne? Oh, good. Oh, your mother used to make them. Good. I'll be calling you. It was Georgie and Hundy and their cousin Marion Stewart who put together the 5-family genealogy and shared it with so many of our relatives near and far. And if they had not done this, this talk would never have been able to be given. I have the genealogy over there on the table, and you can take a look at it afterwards. So George McLeod, remember, he was the last one to come. After the sale of the mill, George was interviewed by his cousin Herb McLeod and sent to Kalispell, where the Kalispell Merc needed to be departmentalized. By this time, he was married and had a baby on the way. They stayed in Kalispell until after the birth of their daughter, born March 17, 1900. The Hammond Lumber Company had been organized March 22, 1900, and Andrew wanted George to take charge of the lands office in Portland, where the head office was. George became the first employee hired by the Hammond Company, Hammond Lumber Company. He oversaw Hammond's Oregon land acquisitions using his background as a civil engineer. By 1908, the family had moved to San Francisco. And I believe that's when they moved their office. They must have moved their offices by then, the lumber company's main office, to San Francisco. He became vice president in 1920, supervising the company's Oregon state holdings as well as their extensive interests in California. In 1946, George became the fourth president of the Hammond Lumber Company at age 75. From 1951 to 1956, he served as the chairman of the board of the lumber company and oversaw the transfer of the Hammond Lumber Company to Georgia-Pacific. He was not only the first employee, he says, of the Hammond Lumber Company, but also the last. He died in San Francisco and is buried in the Missoula City Cemetery, as is his wife, Aunt Emma. Upon his death, there were obituaries in a number of California and Montana newspapers calling him a distinguished Pacific Coast lumberman and one of the West's most famous lumbermen. He was the founder of the Western Forestry and Conservation Association and the Redwood Region Conservation Council. He was also a director of the California Protective Association and was active many years in the Pacific Logging Congress. Uncle George and Aunt Emma came to Montana often. Both my cousin and Annie remember stories about them. When they were here, we went on many picnics organized by my grandfather, Walter. We'd go up the Jocko and down the Bitterroot. I remember attending Uncle George's funeral in Missoula when I was still in high school. I saw Aunt Emma one last time before she died in 1966. My husband and I stopped in Monterey, where Aunt Emma was hospitalized, and had a wonderful visit with her. I was unable to attend her funeral, but I have visited their graves and all the graves of those who I have mentioned many times over the years. I love cemeteries. John Martin Keith, I almost forgot to talk about him, but he would have been Uncle Jack, married to Aunt Hattie Beckwith. His employ in Missoula was largely in banking. Oh, and he was from New Brunswick. His name is on the Articles of Incorporation of the Big Blackfoot Milling Company, using the initials JM. He was known in our family as Jack. He too, came from New Brunswick, along with his brother Harry, to clerk for Andrew at the Eddie Hammond and Company stores. John in Missoula, Jack, and Harry in Kalispell. They came in 1880 or 1881 or 1885, depending upon which source you want to believe. We know they are here at least by 1885. He was promoted to office manager of the Missoula store before leaving in 1888 to become cashier for the Missoula National Bank. By 1893, Andrew Hammond became president of the bank and renamed it the First National Bank. John as vice president and chief executive in charge of the fairs until 1918. In 1918, he became the first president of the reorganized Missoula Trust and Savings, as well as president of the First National Bank at Plains, and a member of the Hammond Lumber Company in San Francisco. He was also secretary of the South Missoula Land Company and vice president of the Missoula Real Estate Association, both Hammond enterprises. He was member of the school board, the library board. He was a Mason and a member of the Elks. He was elected mayor of Missoula 3 times without opposition. In 1891 for 12 months, 1895 for 24 months, and 1907 for 24 months. He was the 9th, 12th, and 18th Missoula mayor. He died in Missoula in 1929 and is buried in the Missoula Cemetery. I was going to skip this, but I guess I better give it about my great-grandfather and Annie's grandfather. And Elizabeth's great-grandfather. Yeah, Elizabeth and I are the same generation. She's my second cousin. although I'm old enough to be her mother. It's confusing. Okay, so the store was, he came in 1880 and clerked. In 1885, when the store was reorganized into the Missoula Mercantile Company, he became manager. In 1889, he became vice president and manager. In 1909, he became president and manager, and he retired in 1940. He died in 1846 and is buried in the Missoula City Cemetery. He was involved in a number of Hammond's ventures, including the Missoula Light and Power Company, the First National Bank, Missoula Water Company, Missoula Real Estate Association, which built the first Florence Hotel, which was named after Andrew's wife. South Missoula Land Company, that owned much of the land south of the Clark Fork River, active in state and city politics, active in the Missoula Chamber of Commerce, charter and life member of the local Elks Lodge, a Rotarian, member of the Episcopal Church, and supported many organizations, including the Boy Scouts and St. Patrick's Hospital. And there you have it. Thank you. Oh, I didn't even pay any attention to you, sorry. Were there any questions that you wanted to stop?
I have not seen any questions.
Oh, good.
Gary, do you want to pass? Yeah.
All right, does anybody have any questions that popped up?
Roberta?
I speak rather loudly. I got confused about whether it was the Keith or whether it was who was the mayor 3 times of Missoula. Which one of those people was the mayor 3 times of Missoula?
John Keith.
That was a Keith.
Yeah. Who was married to, the question was, who was the mayor 3 times in Missoula? That was John M. Keith, who we called Jack.
Thank you.
Yeah, and he was married to a Beckwith sister, Hattie, whose real name was Harriet.
Mary, a question. The book, one of the books you showed up there earlier was, I think the title is When Money Grew on Trees.
Yes.
Which is really a fun book to read. But one of the interesting parts that I found in there was that that there was no stumpage paid, that basically the mills were going out and just logging the surrounding areas, and it was free timber.
That's right. And later on, they were sued.
Oh, were they?
Oh, yeah. And Kim probably can tell more about that, about...
Well, you need just to summarize the question.
Oh.
For the Zoom crowd, they don't know what you're saying.
Yeah, they can't, the Zoom crowd can't hear what you're saying.
I thought I just explained it. Maybe I didn't. But in that particular book, When Money Grew on Trees...
When Money Grew on Trees...
I remember reading that there was no stumpage paid by the mills to purchase the timber.
Right, they just took the trees. They didn't pay for anything. They just... And
Okay.
a lot of it belonged to the Northern Pacific, but a lot of it didn't.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, thank
But
you.
this is a very interesting book if you're interested in the law. Well, yeah. Andrew Hammond, and it says A.B. Hammond and the Age of the Timber Baron.
Anybody else?
It was my understanding, I also read that book, that they used all the Northern Pacific's land rights. They got every other section through the state and so many 100 yards off of each side of the railroad. So they logged a lot of their own country, but a lot of times they would just keep right on going onto somebody else's country.
Right. The Northern Pacific received land every other, I don't know what the size, part of the sections? Alternate sections along, but so they logged those trees, but also in the sections that were not belonging to the Northern Pacific, they also cut those and got into a little trouble, but and there were lawsuits that were finally settled in 19-something or other. 1900? 1919. and they didn't get paid, they were not fined very much. They, and Hammond, yeah.
Can't keep my mouth shut.
It's okay.
But one small point that was overlooked here is that when these alternate sections were given out to the railroads, that was on their proposed route, not on an established route. And that's why you get over into Idaho in that Locksaw country, where there were huge holdings of timber, of great timber, that were owned by the successors of the Northern Pacific, and there's no railroad for miles and miles and miles.
Right.
So it was along a proposed route.
Right, the sections of land were given out on a proposed route, not the actual route. So there were sections, well, I know there were around Lindbergh Lake and on into the Locksaw, into Idaho.
And Mary, was some of that land also in the Rattlesnake?
I don't know if some of that land was in the Rattlesnake.
I believe that one of the deeds on some of my family's property from years and years ago has an official signature there by a man named McLeod.
Her family
In
has
the
some
Rattlesnake.
papers from the Rattlesnake that at one time had the name McLeod on it. So we don't know whether that was Hammond land or railroad land or what.
I'll show you the papers.
Oh, I can hardly wait to see the papers. Are there any other questions?
So, Mary, my question is, you grew up on McLeod Avenue.
I grew up on McLeod Avenue.
What is the,
Was the street named after C.H. McLeod? Yes, it was.
Okay.
Was the Beckwith Street named after Charles E. Beckwith, his father-in-law? Yes, it was. Was Keith Avenue named after John Keith? Yes, it was.
So, Mary, I have a question about what you said about the number of ties per mile. I mean, just thinking about the amount of lumber that was harvested during those railroad days, what was that number of ties per mile? 3,000?
3,000 ties per mile.
So,
And another source said 3,500 ties per mile. So that's a lot of lumber. That's a lot of
lumber.
timber.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. Well, it said, what, 250 200 miles
From,
or 175, depending upon which book you read.
yeah. Huh.
Right.
Any other questions?
Mary Ann has a question
Oh.
over here.
I'm wondering, in that time frame, was there any correlation with the building of the Mullen Road that you know of?
No, the Mullen Road had been built before that. I wish I remember Kim, do you know when the Mullen Road came through?
in the early 60s?
In the early 1860s, and we're talking 1880s.
20 years earlier.
Yeah, so it was 20 years earlier that the Mullen Road was built. Good question. Yes.
Okay, when you talked about way early on when they first arrived from Canada and they established the town of Hellgate.
They didn't establish the town of Hellgate, it was already established.
Yeah, and that's out on Mullen Road, isn't it? Isn't that where that was?
I believe so.
And that Hellgate, there's a convenience store there now, I think that was right. Yeah, a Conoco gas station is there. Still,
Okay, yeah.
yeah.
So I'm Myra Schultz, and I'm a great-granddaughter of Francis Lyman Worden. And Francis Lyman Worden and Christopher P. Higgins established the store out at Hellgate. And so our relatives knew each other decades before we knew each other.
That's true. Myra Schultz just spoke and said that, we knew one another back in high school, that her relatives and my relatives knew one another long before we knew one another, because she is, her great-grandfather was Francis Lyman-Worthen, right, Lyman-Worthen. I'm getting tongue-tied, I've talked too much. And they established the store in Hellgate, right?
Right, and then they founded Missoula.
And then they founded Missoula. Right. So there was a rivalry. But the rivalry between Higgins and Hammond, from what I was reading, was having to do with the railroad, because Higgins had donated the land for the depot and the roundhouse and that sort of thing. And I think they assumed that they were going to get the contract for the lumber, but in the afternoon, after they had met with Higgins and his people, Andrew took the agent from the railroad up to Flathead Lake, and by the time they came back, the Eddie Hammond Company had the contract for the lumber. And it's been, I think it was a sore spot for the rest of Higgins's life. And when Bob Brown talks about Higgins at the Missoula City Cemetery, when they have the stories and stones, he doesn't say nice things about Hammond. I went up to him and said, you know, you're not saying very nice things about my relative.
Anybody else? Going once, going twice. Last chance.
Well, I have to thank you all for coming and listening to my story. I hope it didn't bore you to death. Thank you. And thank you, Kim, for asking me.
Well, really, thank you for coming over. There are so many guys named George.
Oh, I know.
I better get in front of the camera.
Yeah.
There are so many guys named George. One of the interesting things that I found when we were talking about this, the year that George Hammond, who lived and died in Ovando, the same year he died, another George Hammond was part of the famous Bearmouth train robbery. But our George Hammond was already dead, and it was not his fault. But at the same time, there was a George Hammond that lived in Deer Lodge, and I think one that lived in Phillipsburg. So it gets really confusing. Our George Hammond, Mary's George Hammond, was in charge of the lumber operation throughout the Hammond Mills time here in Bonner, while his brother Henry, of course, as she explained, was the head of the mill itself. Mm-hmm. So I really appreciate Mary's efforts. I got a chance to visit her house in Helena, and she has a lot of genealogical projects going on beyond this. And pictures, albums, family trees, everything you want to know. And it's just a fascinating place to visit, at least it is for me. And she's just recently retired as the president of the Lewis and Clark Genealogical Society, which is housed there at the Helena Library.
Right.
And had been that for 10 or 12 years.
12.
Now 12 years, and actually was a co-founder of it, I believe, back in
One of the first ones, yeah.
One of the
in
first
1984. We took a group of us took a genealogy class, an adult ed class, from a retired high school principal. And we loved the class so much we didn't want to quit. So we talked him into helping us start a genealogy society. So the Lewis and Clark County Genealogical Society was starting about 1984. And he was our first president, and it's been going on ever since. How many years ago was that? A long time ago. Over 40 years.